a question I get asked a lot, which is very reasonable, is like, hey, you make all these game modes, why don't you make them permanent, right? Like, why not just, turn them on and leave them on? What's the harm in that? Just let people play it if they like it, right? There's actually a number of problems with having permanent modes. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't have permanent modes. Obviously, if League has more cool things you can do all the time, that's a huge win, right? But there's a few things that you have to consider when making something permanent. Number one is upkeep. That one's a really big deal. It's kind of the idea that, nothing in a game like League just stays working perfectly forever. You're going to need people upkeeping it, tuning it, fixing bugs, fixing engineering problems, all those different things. And so if you're going to make a mode permanent forever, that adds a permanent upkeep to everything we do, which 100% is worth it with things like Aram, for example, but it's not necessarily ideal when, like, say, you have a mode like Dominion that got so incredibly few people that, like, it became to the point where it's like it wasn't really even worth upkeeping it. Another issue with making a mode permanent is just queue times and stuff. Like, basically, the longer a mode is permanent, the worse the queue times get. The smaller a queue's population, the worse the queue times get, the worse the queue health gets. And so, like, it has to be able to, like, support a, like, really good queue, basically, so that people are playing it and you can find people to play with, right? And then, those are the big things. There's a few other stuff to consider as well. Now, that said, Swarm, specifically, as a PvE mode that's kind of, like, branched off of League of Legends, has some advantages that are worth talking about. One is that queue times don't really matter with it because it's PvE. We are going to have a queue you can play with, like, random people, but you can also just play it alone or with your friends, right? So queue times are a lot less important because it's a PvE mode. And the other thing about it is that because all the characters in Swarm are, like, different champions, basically, like Seraphine in Swarm is not Seraphine in League of Legends, that actually can reduce upkeep. Because one of the things about, say, something like Star Guardian Odyssey, or Odyssey, is that the characters in those modes were still based off the League of Legends characters. So if Jinx changed in League, she would have to be fixed in Odyssey, if that makes sense. Whereas Swarm is somewhat branched off. It's, like, in a lot of ways, a different game. And so that actually means that upkeep to Swarm stays within Swarm, versus upkeep to a mode like Odyssey would have required, like, constantly keeping track of what that character does compared to, say, their League counterpart. Anyways, this is not me saying that this will be permanent. I want to be very, very clear. There's not a plan to make it permanent at the moment. But that said, with everything we do, one of the things we're always looking for is how people like it, right? So if this comes out or other game modes come out and, people like them a lot and there's a lot of players who play it and, think it's really cool, then that always asks us starting the question of, like, oh, wow, maybe we should consider bringing this back. Or maybe one day it should be permanent or whatever, right? Now, I'm not saying that's the case with Swarm, but, like, there's a reason we bring back Earth all the time, and that's because we know people really, really like it, right? So we're always going to be looking when we do these kind of things to understand, like, hey, is there something here? Is there something that people are going to want to, like, come back to?